I've got some bad news. If you're watching this video, that probably means you've chosen Cardano, which also means you have not made the easiest choice. However, you might have also made a genius choice for a very specific reason. If this is the first time that someone's implied you are a genius in 2024, or if you're finding value in these videos, please consider delegating to the Army of Spies stake pool, ticker AOS. There is a very certain rationale, a very specific thesis that led a lot of us to get into Cardano. Sure, there are a lot of reasons you might have gotten into Cardano. You might have just liked the sound of the name. You might have picked it for some other random reason. Maybe it's just one out of 100 different, base layer assets you hold. Who knows? But there is a very specific thesis that led a lot of people to get into Cardano, including me. This was a central part of my thesis around Cardano all those years ago. But regardless of why you got into Cardano, it should be made clear Cardano was not the easiest choice. The easiest choice was going with the herd, being one of the sheep among the herd that just chose the second biggest cryptocurrency, Ethereum. If you don't choose Ethereum, in crypto, people are going to ask the question, why aren't you choosing Ethereum? If you just say, hey, I'm into Bitcoin and Ethereum, people are going to be like, of course you are. That's the logical herd choice. That's what everyone else is doing. You're not going to get a lot of weird questions. You're not going to get those weird looks. People aren't going to think of you as some kind of an enemy, a member of a different tribe. So if you chose Cardano, you didn't choose that path. You chose something harder, something that's not as easy as just going with the herd. You're already an intellectual outlier if you didn't choose Ethereum. And I know a lot of people hold Ethereum and Cardano. That is certainly true. Bitcoin, Ethereum, and Cardano, many, many different cryptocurrencies. A lot of people are holding a whole portfolio. But for some reason, you either chose Cardano or you also chose Cardano. And here's the central part of the thesis that's starting to play out, at least the central part of my thesis that I think is really important. And it's something that a lot of people overlooked back in the day. But back in the day, something really important to me was this looming specter of government intervention. I knew at some point there was going to be regulation of cryptocurrencies. It wasn't going to be able to exist forever. And there are kind of a couple different ways you could deal with that. You could either make your blockchain regulation resistant. And I'm not saying that that's a complete answer. I'm not saying you can 100% bulletproof your cryptocurrency from regulators. Certainly, even in the case of Bitcoin, regulators could come along in any country in the world and just say, hey, no one's allowed to use Bitcoin here. And that's not going to be 100% enforceable for them, but it's still going to cause major problems for you if you hold, say, Bitcoin. Or in the case of something like an Ethereum or a Cardano, they could say, hey, actually, we're going to regulate staking. We're going to regulate staking because staking, it happens a lot differently than cryptocurrency proof of work mining. Proof of work mining could be something that happens in your basement and nobody's any the wiser. But the second you're talking about staking, and specifically staking like it happens in Ethereum and Cardano and a lot of other blockchains, it involves stake pools, which have to attract delegators. They have to get people to stake with them. Then all of a sudden, you're getting into this territory that regulators are going to be very interested in because they don't have to go around and search everybody's basement to see if they have an ASIC down there mining this cryptocurrency. They can just look who is out there attracting delegators, who are people delegating to. It's kind of a public thing. It's something that happens not always, but often in the light of day. It's a lot easier for them to regulate. So I knew if we were going to go into staking, we were probably going to have to deal with the regulators one day. And what usually happens with regulators? What usually happens with regulators is that they go after the easiest cases. The thing they're going to regulate is going to be the one that is most obviously a deviation from the status quo. That's the thing that gets regulated. It's not it's not when you're 1 mile over the speed limit that you get pulled over the fastest. It's when you're 30 miles over the speed limit, 50 miles over the speed limit, you're more likely to get pulled over. Sure, you get pulled over being 1 mile over the speed limit too, but you're a lot more likely to get pulled over if you're 50 miles over the speed limit. Here's where Cardano comes in. Cardano realized this. The founders of Cardano realized this. Charles of IOG and Emergo and the Cardano Foundation. These are all the founding entities. But among that combination of entities and the individuals making up those entities, there was this recognition that someday proof of stake blockchains were going to encounter regulators. And those regulators were going to regulate the thing that looked most like to them, that looked most like the thing they're used to regulating. And you know what financial regulators love to regulate? They love to regulate this scenario where you take someone's money and you do something with it and they're expecting a return because you took their money and you did something with it. What does that imply? Well, the first thing it implies is custodianship of that money. You actually take the money. You have custody of the money. So, what did Cardano do? They said, "Hey, why don't we go to this huge amount of trouble to design a proof of stake system where the stake pools don't take custody of the money? What if they don't take the money? Doesn't that short circuit a big piece of this scenario that financial regulators love to regulate? Yeah, it does. And they actually went to the trouble of designing a system where that's possible. This is the way staking happens in Cardano. The stake pools don't take custody of your money. They don't have the private keys to your account. You don't have to transfer your ADA to the stake pool. You just delegate to the stake pool. The stake pool never actually takes your ADA. They can't take your ADA and waste it on something they want to buy. They can't take it and dispose of it. It's still in your custody and never leaves your custody. So what are the other things that financial regulators love to regulate? When you lose someone's money, when you take their money and you lose it, right? Or even if, let's imagine a scenario where a stake pool doesn't take custody, but they can still cause the delegator to lose the assets, to lose their money. Regulators don't like it when you lose someone else's money. They seem to be okay with us losing our own money in some cases, not in all, but that's a lot more okay than if you lose someone else's money. So in Cardano, they designed a system where they're able to enforce the right behaviors. They're able to disincentivize the bad behaviors and incentivize the good behaviors without making the delegators lose their money. This was a genius level decision by the founding and the founding entities of Cardano, the entities at least who were involved in designing the proof of stake system. The designers of the proof of stake system in Cardano were geniuses in that they designed it to not raise the hackles of the regulators. They looked at financial regulation and said to themselves, I'm assuming this is what happened because the end result certainly implies it, that, hey, regulators like to regulate what looks familiar to them, what they're used to regulating, what seems like the biggest deviation from the status quo they're trying to enforce in other circumstances in their normal environment. So let's design a system that doesn't do any of those things that they love to regulate. That's the way Cardano designed their system. What did our biggest competitor do? The place where all the members of the herd, the mainstream herd, all went to Ethereum. Why? Because that was the commonly accepted wisdom. Of course you go to the number 2 blockchain. Of course you go to the biggest smart contract blockchain. Of course you go to Ethereum. You go there because that's where everybody else already is, and that's where everybody keeps going. You don't question the orthodoxy. You just go with the flow. You go with the orthodoxy. So what did What did that choice of the mainstream do instead? Instead, they decided to enforce the right behaviors in their staking system through slashing. Through slashing, the delegators can actually lose their assets. Right off the bat, we're doing something that the regulators love to regulate, losing somebody else's money. Compounding the injuries here. In order to have slashing, the stake pools need to have custody of those assets. So they also created a stake in order to make the slashing thing work, which is the easy solution. It's the first thing you think of, even if you knew nothing about blockchains, even if you just knew a tiny bit about blockchains. Like the very first time I ever heard about proof of stake, I thought to myself, okay, well, how are they going to keep those stake pools from, validating the wrong things? Proof of stake is how we're selecting the leader who will validate the next block. How do we make sure they validate the next block correctly? The first thing I thought of was, oh, you dock their stake. You punish them if they do the wrong things by taking away some of that stake. I mean, it's a stake. It implies you could lose it. It's the obvious choice. And that's exactly what Ethereum did. They created this proof of stake system that has slashing. But because they have slashing, the stake pools had to have custody of the assets. So they're exactly where you don't want to be if you're thinking about regulation. All those years ago, Cardano did think about that. That's why if you chose Cardano, and you probably did if you're listening to this video, watching this video, you probably chose Cardano. It was not the easy choice. The entire mainstream was going to Ethereum, but it was the smart choice because eventually proof of stake blockchains were going to encounter regulators looking for the easiest thing to regulate. Eventually, was going to happen, and it's starting to happen now. It's starting to happen right now. So you might have seen this article posted. This is called Switzerland's Federal Financial Market Supervisory Authority, FINMA, publishes guidance on staking. We see articles like this all the time. You have to remember, we're not just talking about some random country, that has a casual relationship with financial regulation, that doesn't have a lot of financial stuff going on. We're talking about Switzerland. When you think of Switzerland, you think of a few different things, and one of them is banking and finance. So you have to assume they might be a little bit ahead of the curve when it comes to banking regulation stuff, because banking is one of the things that you think of when you think of Switzerland. And sure enough, what do we have here? So Switzerland's FINMA decided they would lay out a few different things, a few thresholds, a few different categories. So, what did they say? They're saying on the 20th of December, 2023, FINMA published its guidance on staking, which contains a description of various types of staking and includes the risks, the supervisory treatment, and the legal consequences for this act. So, they're basically saying, hey, we're going to regulate staking. But in order to regulate stuff, regulators need categories. So, sure enough, the next question is who picked, who put themselves in the right category? Was it Cardano? Was it Ethereum? Was it someone else? Let's find out. So, this general description is typically common to all proof of stake mechanisms, even if they may have differences in the implementation. And up above, they just kind of described proof of stake. Such as, and here are the distinctions, here are the categories they're going to start laying out, such as sanction mechanisms for non-compliance, slashing, or specific exit lockup periods. So immediately, one of the first things they hit is slashing. What do they hit next? And they're going in the right order because the one thing implies the other. Slashing implies validator custody. Type of staking, custodial versus non-custodial. And people get confused about this because some people are thinking, it's custodial versus non-custodial depending on whether or not the delegate or whether or not the end consumer has custody. Other people are thinking, does the validator have custody? So here, when they say non-custodial, what they mean is that the customer the end consumer, the delegator, has custody. So custodial, non-custodial in their terminology is going to be the end user having custody because the stake pool does not have custody. So it's non-custodial. So they lay this out. They're like, hey, the stake pool could have custody or the end user could have custody. And it's obvious when regulators start making categories, it's usually fairly binary. You want to be in one category, you don't want to be in the other. And then they start talking about other things like slashing. So right off the bat, we can see Ethereum is going to be in the wrong category here. They're going to be in this category where the stake pool has custody. Cardano is going to be in the other category, the non custodial category. The customer maintains exclusive control over the withdrawal keys, and there is no custody or acceptance of crypto assets by third parties. Important, no one is accepting your crypto assets from you in Cardano. Then down here, we get into some very interesting language. A banking license is not required for individual custody of payment tokens held in readiness at all times. Here we have another really important category. Readiness at all times. Such custodians remain, however, subject to anti money laundering rules and regulations and must become members of self regulatory organizations for anti money laundering purposes, an SRO. So notice they're saying if you have custody, the tokens better be in readiness at all times, or else you will be subject to AML regulations and you must join a self regulatory organization for AML purposes. So, already, if you have custody, you're already in trouble. They're talking about things like banking licenses. On the contrary, this means that if such readiness cannot be provided by the relevant service provider, a banking license will be required. A full banking license will also be required in case of collective accounts without clear customer shares. So, if you have custody in staking and you are the stake pool, they're talking about banking licenses, and that's just if you have custody. If you don't have readiness at all times, then you're also subject to AML rules and joining an SRO, which is going to be for AML purposes. So already, if the stake pool has custody, really bad. You made the wrong choice when you set up your proof of stake system in terms of the direction Switzerland's going, and Switzerland might just be the vanguard of regulation here. They might just be a little bit ahead of the curve. But if let's say if your foundation is in Switzerland, which is true of both Ethereum and Cardano, I believe. At least the Ethereum Foundation was set up in Switzerland. I assume it's still Charles. If you know a little bit about the history of Ethereum, Charles was in charge of that, and the foundations of both Ethereum and Cardano were both set up in Switzerland because it was the best, regulatory situation. But here it turns out not so much. Years later, if Switzerland is just the first to put in place very, very predictable regulatory requirements like this, and they're like, hey, really bad if your stake pools have custody, because now we're talking about banking licenses and maybe AML stuff if you don't have readiness at all times. So, what does readiness at all times mean? Well, luckily, they explain that quite clearly down here. Staking without lockup or sanction mechanisms. The sanction mechanisms would be slashing or lockup exit periods. So they say for FINMA without lockup periods, slashing, or similar restrictions on access, the readiness is ensured and crypto assets are available to the customer at all times and can thus be segregated. However, the staking involves a risk of slashing and or a lockup exit period while the provider retains the power of disposal over the withdrawal keys. FINMA points out that there are, for the time being, no international recommendations and no relevant precedents as to whether such staked crypto assets still meet the criterion of being held in readiness at all times. In such a situation, it is unclear whether the crypto assets can be returned at any time. So here we're seeing this coming to fruition. Cardano went to the trouble of designing this very novel, very interesting, very innovative staking system specifically to match what they correctly predicted was going to be the direction of regulation. If you have lockup periods or slashing or these restrictions on access, like lockup exit periods, you're in a much worse position than if you're Cardano. It says right here, it's like basically a safe harbor they're describing. For FINMA, without lockup period, slashing, or similar restrictions on access, the readiness is ensured. Not only are they saying you probably have readiness, they're saying the readiness is ensured. And what they're describing sounds exactly like Cardano. What they're describing down here, though, where they're saying in such a situation, it's unclear. They're saying no relevant precedents exist, no international recommendations. It's unclear whether you still meet the criterion of being held in readiness at all times. Down here, they're FINMA's kind of hedging their bets. They're kind of seeing where they want to go later. They're not declaring it outright, not readiness at all times, but they are also saying you're not meeting the safe harbor up here. If you have slashing or lockup exit periods, that's a lot of proof of stake systems. With Ethereum, we do have a risk of slashing. And with a lot of other, and we have lockup exit periods. With a lot of other blockchains that rely on proof of stake, we have a lot of lockup and exit periods, which I'm sure at the time sounded like a great idea to them because they didn't have the same foresight that the designers of the Cardano proof of stake system had. They knew that you don't want the stake pools to have custody. And that means you can't have slashing or lockup exit periods because if your ADA was locked up, then you wouldn't really have full custody. You wouldn't have the full bundle of sticks that correspond to full ownership of those assets. In Cardano, you do have these. And surprise, surprise, all these years later, Cardano predicted correctly. They were smarter. The design of Cardano is a lot smarter. And here we're just talking about FINMA, this regulator in Switzerland. But this is Switzerland. Do you think the US is going to be more lax than Switzerland? Do you think the dragon is going to pass some bill where she's okay with us being more lax, more lenient than Switzerland? No. The US is not likely to be more lax than Switzerland. I don't think. I mean, there are stereotypes about Swiss finance, that may have been more true decades and decades ago than they are today. But certainly, I don't think someone like the Dragon or any of her anti crypto army is going to be comfortable if the US is less strict than Switzerland. That's probably not going to happen. You're probably going to see more restrictive stuff in a lot of places like the US than you are in Switzerland. There's a reason those foundations are in Switzerland. It's because they were perceived to be more friendly than other nation states, which kind of fits, which kind of fits the stereotype. Again, that might have been more true decades and decades ago, but it kind of fits the perception a lot of people have of Switzerland, that it's a friendly place to do banking. It's a friendly place for banking and financial services. It's it's it could be predictable that the US is not going to be more lenient than Switzerland. What happens if this is just the first ripple in the pond? What if we see many, many countries around the world passing regulation on staking that turns all the Ethereum stake pools into banks? Says they have to have a banking license, they have to do AML, they have to join SROs because they're not hitting any of the good criteria here. They're not hitting any of the good thresholds. Cardano, as near as I can tell, is hitting almost everything, and Ethereum is hitting none of them. And let's face it, there's a lot of proof of stake blockchains out there, but the real show, the big contest here is Cardano and Ethereum. I won't even get into some of the other blockchains that kind of flit in and out of these positions above and below Cardano, some of which have that on off button. But a lot of the other proof of stake blockchains, even if they don't have slashing, and a lot of them do have slashing, but even if they don't have slashing, they have lockup periods, which means they're not meeting the criteria here either for readiness. while Cardano is in a beautiful spot. So, like I said, you didn't choose the easy solution, you didn't follow the mainstream herd, but you might have picked the genius position of choosing the blockchain that most predicted the way regulation was going to go. Okay, I know that was a long conversation about one regulatory item, but that's really, really important. Something like that could make or break a blockchain, even one as big as Ethereum. Can you imagine if every Ethereum stake pool suddenly has to do AML, KYC on everyone, and they have to have a banking license? This is not a small deal. That's a really, really big deal. And I'm just happy Cardano predicted that correctly. You know what else? You know what else is turning out in our favor? The robbery forest is not dying. Definitely, it is still the case. If you are the prince of the kingdom and you are looking to ride your horse into the forest where the bandits will steal all of your gold and all of your jewels, definitely definitely the EVM world is where you want to go, because this doesn't end. As much as I think it must get better at some point, we just see thefts over and over and over again in the EVM world. And it's looking like this bull cycle is going to be no different. Here we have a nice thread. Someone just lost 5 million in an ERC20 phishing transaction using so-called increase allowance method. And then there's a whole thread about the increase allowance method. They mention ERC20 phishing scams netted 50 million to the bad guys, mostly using permit, increase allowance, and approve. And then they go through and they're going to describe those little mechanisms. 50 million is a lot. Remember, I said another one of the things that regulators love to regulate is when you lose someone else's money. And that's certainly happening in the EVM world to this day. Here's some good news. While Thailand seems to be moving in the direction of re-illegalizing a certain plant that has been very popular in Thailand over the last couple of years, they're giving us something good in crypto. This article says, as reported by the Bangkok Post, Thailand revealed its new move to develop the country's digital asset industry, and crypto trading will be exempt from the 7% VAT requirement. The finance ministry announced the exemption of value-added tax on digital assets trading to push Thailand toward becoming a digital asset hub. This sounds like a great idea by a country like Thailand to embrace crypto instead of constantly vacillating back and forth like some countries do between sort of embracing crypto and sort of making it completely illegal. I think that regulatory trend we talked about at the beginning of this video might be the most important thing going on for Cardano right now and for all proof of stake cryptocurrencies. But this right here might be the most important thing going on for all cryptocurrencies. This post says Fidelity has a 1 to 3% Bitcoin allocation in their all in one asset allocation funds in Canada using spot Bitcoin ETFs. The conservative version is posted below. When and if this becomes the norm for portfolios in the US, wow. And as you can see, they've got investment grade debt at 59%, US equities at 19, international equities at 9, Canadian equities at 9, crypto at 1. Think about that. He says this is for a Canadian all-in-one fund, and Canadian equities are only at 9.6%. Crypto is at 1%. This is just a small ripple, but is this just the start of something that gets very, very, very big in this bull cycle? If you were worried that maybe another one of our competitors had lost their on-off function, don't worry. They have not lost their on-off functionality. The on-off switch apparently still very much existing. This headline says, just in, Solana network has stopped processing transactions due to an outage. This was some time ago, but I just can't help it. I can't help commenting every time their on-off functionality comes in so handy. While we've already discussed tonight items that might end up being the biggest stories for Cardano and for crypto generally over the coming term, this might be the biggest story in macro over the coming term, the biggest story for the global economy. So, the reason why people aren't paying that much attention to this anymore is because people have been sounding the alarm, going clear back years, clear back in my mind at least to 2017, 2018, when those first videos started gaining a little bit more exposure. I think the famous one that really stands out in my mind was when ADV China went to a ghost village, a ghost city, and they were peeling the concrete off the foundation of a brand new building to show the ridiculous construction that was underneath this concrete and explaining why it didn't really matter, because what was happening was that these ghost towers and ghost developments were being built, and the condos or townhouses, whatever the units were being traded like commodities. No one was ever going to live in these buildings. They were basically just financial instruments. Prices were constantly going up, and a huge proportion of family wealth in China was being invested in real estate because nobody really trusted the equities markets in a CCP controlled China. But real estate was tangible, it was there. There was an actual condo, there was an actual townhouse, there was an actual development. It was a little bit more trustworthy until it wasn't. And maybe the biggest sign of this, a story we've been covering for a long time, we've been following for a long time, has been the story of Evergrande, the biggest real estate company in China and in the world. And it's been in trouble for a long time. And now we're seeing the death song of Evergrande. And a lot of the world is still not paying attention. Even this month, when we're finally seeing headlines like this: Western hedge funds that saw a killing in billions of Evergrande bonds, stunned when government handed out 99% haircut instead, according to sources. This is how bad things are in China, in the Chinese economy. You still see a lot of people talking about how strong and surging the Chinese economy is. They're not the people who are paying attention, granted, but there's still a lot of people talking about how the Chinese economy is going to overtake the US economy and China is so strong. But yet, here we see the biggest real estate company in all of China is in liquidation, and the government just decided that all of their Western hedge fund bondholders get to take a 99% loss. That's how bad things really are in China. Even in a CCP controlled China where there's absolutely no transparency into what's actually happening, one of the biggest companies in the entire country in this gigantic economy has gone from being the subject of massive Western investment to those Western investors taking a 99% loss. This story is kind of being ignored on the macro scene because the only thing people care about anymore is what the central banks are doing. We've gotten The global economy is so much controlled by what the large central banks do these days that nobody thinks these things matter anymore. But when you have a country like China and so much family wealth is tied up in real estate, and the entire real estate sector collapses, which was super obvious if you watch those videos about these ghost towers and ghost cities. It was super obvious this was eventually going to happen. When this happens, you can't really turn a blind eye. You can't say this doesn't matter when it's China, the second biggest economy in the entire world, and so much of their family wealth is tied up in this sector. This is probably going to matter regardless of how little attention people are paying to it. Hopefully, it won't have any super detrimental effects on crypto until after this next crypto bull cycle plays out. But who knows? Things are so messed up with the way the central banks are controlling everything in the global economy these days. It's hard to predict what will matter and what won't at the end of the day. I hope you're having a great February. I hope you're looking forward to a great week, and I'll talk to you soon.